Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into something really fascinating from the source material you sent over.
Ah, yes, the comparative paper.
Right, this analysis exploring a real paradox. It's about how two nations, Australia and Malaysia, see their farmers in such dramatically different ways.
It really is striking, isn't it? Both countries rely heavily on agriculture for their economies, for food.
But the perception,
Yeah.
completely different. In one, farmers are almost like national icons.
Celebrated, yeah. While in the other, the paper argues they're largely, well, invisible culturally, overlooked.
Exactly.
Ah.
So our mission here is to unpack why. What does this paper tell us about the cultural, the historical, the policy reasons behind this?
And what it reveals about national identity, maybe, how we value work, the stories we tell ourselves.
It's a great question the paper raises.
Mhm.
How can the social standing of people doing this absolutely essential work be so different?
Right. Let's dive in and see what the analysis found.
Okay, so let's start with Australia. The paper kicks off by highlighting this almost mythical status farmers have there.
Yeah, they're painted as this sort of real Australian, weathered, stoic, authentic.
Deeply connected to the land.
And the paper traces this back quite a ways. It talks about country-mindedness.
Ah, yes, that early 20th century idea.
Exactly. This agrarian sentiment positioning life on the land as just fundamentally better, more virtuous, healthier, more important than city life.
It's a powerful ideal. And I was struck by the paper's point about the landscape itself.
The vastness of it.
Yeah, and how the farmer figure becomes the way Australians relate psychologically to that landscape. It's like the farmer embodies who we are in relation to the continent.
That connection is key. And the paper argues this mythologizing wasn't accidental. It started way back, colonial period, but really got cemented early 20th century.
Making the pioneer farmer into this kind of democratic hero.
Totally. Independent, resilient, wrestling meaning from the wild land, that whole narrative.
And it wasn't just cultural. There was a political dimension too, right? The paper mentions the Country Party.
Oh, definitely. From the 1920s to the 70s, they heavily promoted this country-mindedness. They basically presented rural Australia as the moral heartland.
And the cities.
As vampire cities. That's the term the paper quotes. Sucking the life out of the virtuous countryside.
Wow, vampire cities.
Yeah,
It's intense.
It really shows the strength of that rhetoric, and you see it echoed culturally in media representations.
Always the authentic Aussie, uncorrupted, wise in practical ways.
Connected to the land, yeah. And the paper notes how drought stories reinforce this. The farmer battling the elements becomes the symbol of national resilience.
Which gives them influence way beyond their numbers. The paper says farmers are less than 3% of the workforce.
But they punch well above their weight politically, partly electoral geography, sure.
But also hugely because of this ingrained mythological status. Politicians invoke them constantly.
As symbols of core Australian values, and it even extends to marketing, right?
Yeah, selling Australian products globally by tying them to this image of like clean, honest Aussie values embodied by the farmer.
It's a very coherent narrative.
Though the paper is careful to include the critical perspective too. It mentions recent scholarship challenging the myth.
Pointing out how it often ignores the dispossession of indigenous peoples, right?
Exactly. That romanticizing of winning the land erases a much more complex and painful history.
Which is crucial context. These powerful national stories often have significant blind spots.
Okay, so that's the Australian picture. The farmer as hero, deeply embedded in the national psyche. Now let's pivot. Malaysia.
And it's such a stark contrast. The paper calls farmers there invisible in plain sight.
Despite employing around 11% of the workforce.
Yeah.
And being vital for food security.
Yep. But culturally, nationally, largely absent from the conversation, according to the analysis.
So why? The paper points to Malaysia's path after independence in 1957.
Right. The big push was for rapid industrial modernization, not celebrating agrarian life.
So agriculture was seen more as a starting point.
A foundation, yeah, or a stepping stone. Something
Yeah.
to build on to get to industrial development. It wasn't the destination itself.
Which meant farmers weren't viewed as icons, but more as people needing assistance.
Exactly. People to be helped, modernized, maybe eventually moved into what were seen as more advanced sectors. The focus was efficiency, maybe even making farming less necessary over time.
Interesting. And the paper argues Malaysia's post-independence identity became very urban-focused.
Very much so. The symbols of national pride were modern things. Think Kuala Lumpur's towers, not rice paddies.
So agriculture almost became symbolically backward, tied to the past.
That seems to be the argument, something the nation was moving beyond, not something defining its modern character.
And as the country urbanized, that feeling just solidified,
Yeah, farming became viewed as something, the older generations did, not part of the contemporary national identity or embodying timeless values.
leading to what the paper terms cultural invisibility.
Right. You just don't see farmers celebrated in pop culture and national stories.
And if they do appear in media,
It's often about problems, the paper notes, needing help, needing subsidies, dealing with pests, not as heroes or role models,
even big agricultural successes like palm oil or rubber.
are usually credited to government policy or big corporations, not the individual farmers doing the work on the ground. That's a key point in the analysis.
Okay, so we have this incredible divergence. Mythologized hero versus culturally invisible worker. The paper really digs into the why. What are the root causes identified?
It points to several interconnected factors. Colonial legacies are a big one, but they played out very differently.
How so?
Well, in Australia, you had a settler colonial structure. Problematic history aside, it did create conditions for mythologizing the pioneer who tamed the land. That laid some groundwork for the hero narrative.
Whereas Malaysia's colonial experience was more about extraction, plantations run for the benefit of the colonial power.
Exactly. That structure, which influenced post-independent setups, didn't really foster the same idea of independent smallholders making their own way, which was so key to the Australian myth.
Scale and landscape also come into it, the paper suggests.
Yeah, the sheer size of Australian farms, those vast properties, adds to the mythological feel. This idea of engaging with the land on a continental scale.
Making the farmer a geographic Superman, as the source puts it.
Yeah, that phrase captures it well. It creates a different kind of resonance than, say, Malaysian rice paddies or smaller holdings. Crucial economically, yes, but maybe not generating the same epic narrative feel.
Then there's demographics and politics.
Right. Australia's electoral system often gives rural areas disproportionate clout. So there's a political incentive to keep elevating farmers culturally to appeal to those voters.
Makes sense. And in Malaysia, much more urban population.
Much more. So the political incentives shift. Less focus on mythologizing agriculture, more focus on urban issues and voters.
And finally, those differing economic models we touched on.
Australia consistently viewing agriculture as a permanent national strength, a core capability.
Feeding the nation, feeding the region, whereas Malaysia saw it more as that foundation stage.
A stage to move beyond. Success was framed as industrializing, which kind of implicitly positioned agriculture as less modern, less aspirational.
What I find really striking is the paradox the paper uncovers between actual policy and this cultural perception.
You mean how you can have strong support policies but no cultural status, or vice versa?
Exactly that. Look at Malaysia. The paper details significant policy support, welfare programs, funding, subsidies, training, regulations.
Real material assistance.
But the paper calls it a technocratic approach.
Yeah.
It's all about the mechanics, the economics. It hasn't created those cultural stories, that social heroification.
So farmers get practical help, but remain culturally kind of invisible.
And then flip to Australia, you have the massive cultural elevation, the hero myth.
But the paper points to real struggles underneath. It mentions data showing remote farmers actually reporting worse mental health than other remote workers, even when finances aren't the issue.
That's quite a finding. It makes you wonder, does that pressure to be the stoic hero make it harder for them to admit they're struggling or ask for help?
It certainly suggests a disconnect, doesn't it, between the myth and the lived reality.
So the core insight here seems to be that cultural value and practical support aren't automatically linked. They can operate on separate tracks.
Which is a really important point the analysis makes.
So how do today's big challenges, climate change, tech, food security, interact with these different perceptions?
Well, the paper suggests they land differently, too. Climate change in Australia, for example, often gets folded back into the hero story.
Farmers battling even tougher odds, reinforcing that resilience narrative.
Pretty much. Whereas in Malaysia, it's framed more technically. It needs policy fixes, new tech. It doesn't really change the farmer's cultural standing.
What about technological change in farming? GPS tractors, drones.
In Australia, the paper kind of asks, how does that fit the old romantic image of the rugged individual? It potentially challenges the myth.
Make it harder to mythologize, maybe.
Perhaps. While in Malaysia, tech is generally welcomed as modernization, but it might even further distance the farmer from cultural value. The focus shifts to the smart systems, not necessarily the farmer's personal skill or wisdom.
And food security. That's been such a big topic globally lately.
In Australia, the paper notes, that plugs right into the existing narrative. Farmers are the guardians of food sovereignty.
Already heroes, now saving the food supply.
Something like that. In Malaysia, the response tends to stay more technocratic, focusing on supply chains, policy mechanisms, investment, rather than elevating the farmer's cultural role in ensuring food security.
So given this whole analysis, what does the paper suggest moving forward? It argues these narratives aren't set in stone, right?
Exactly. They're constructed so they can be revised. For Malaysia, the suggestion isn't to just copy the Australian model.
Because that has its own issues.
Right. But rather to consciously develop distinctly Malaysian narratives that elevate farmers, maybe celebrating traditional knowledge, their role in preserving landscapes, their part in food security.
Creating media that shows farming as a respected path.
Things like that. And for Australia, the paper suggests closing that gap between the myth and the reality.
Making sure support systems, especially mental health, are geared to the actual challenges, not just the stoic ideal.
Yes, balancing the celebration with real practical support. And also, importantly, addressing the problematic bits of the mythology, the indigenous dispossession, environmental impacts.
It's about seeing the picture more clearly, warts and all.
The big takeaway seems to be that how we value farmers isn't just about economics. It's actively built through stories, politics, media.
And they need both things. Genuine cultural respect and practical support.
Absolutely.
So this deep dive really shows that the huge difference in how farmers are viewed in Australia and Malaysia isn't just how things are. It's the result of specific histories, choices, and the stories these nations told themselves.
And why should you, listening, care about this? Well, think about the massive challenges we face: climate, food security, the future of rural life. How we perceive and value the people growing our food directly shapes the support they get, the policies we make.
And whether future generations even see farming as a viable, respected life.
Exactly. The paper leaves us with a really potent thought to consider.
That maybe it's time for both these countries, and perhaps others too, to consciously re-examine their agricultural stories.
Because we depend on farmers, so shouldn't we strive to see them clearly?
Not, as the source puts it, neither as mythical heroes nor as invisible laborers.
But as people doing essential work that deserves both practical support and cultural respect.
The hero worship might be optional, the paper concludes, but that clear-eyed respect and support shouldn't be.
And the stories, after all, are open to revision.
Definitely something to mull over.